Welcome to America's Forbidden History, the channel where we uncover forgotten stories, hidden facts, and the mysteries of the past that shaped our world. If you love history, rare finds, and untold truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us on this journey through time. For thousands of years, farmers planted the seeds of life, not just into the soil, but into the promise of tomorrow. Yet today, something so simple, so natural, has become forbidden. The right to save and replant seeds, a right older than civilization itself, has quietly slipped from our hands. There was a time when farming wasn't just about survival, it was about continuity. Seeds passed from father to son, from grandmother to granddaughter, carrying with them not just food, but memories, traditions, and culture. Every harvest was both an ending and a beginning, a cycle that tied families to their land for generations. But in the last century, that timeless cycle has been disrupted. Corporate patents, legal battles, and genetic tinkering have transformed something once sacred into something strictly controlled. Farmers, who once freely saved and shared the fruits of their labor, now face lawsuits, crushing debts, and contracts written in legalese thicker than the soil itself. This is the story of how we lost the right to save seeds, a story of invention and betrayal, of hope and heartbreak, and of a question that will define our future: who really owns life itself? So tonight, we look back, through the fields of history, into the courtrooms of power, and across the dinner tables of America. This is why farmers can't replant seeds, the shocking truth about seed patents. Long before tractors, long before chemicals, long before paperwork and patents, there was the seed. And in every seed, the promise of another season. For most of human history, saving seeds wasn't a choice, it was survival. Families gathered the best kernels from their harvest, drying them carefully in clay jars, burlap sacks, or wooden bins. These seeds weren't just food, they were a legacy. A single bean variety might carry the fingerprints of countless generations, each farmer selecting the strongest plants to carry forward. It was a cycle as old as civilization itself. The wheat of Mesopotamia, the corn of the Americas, the rice of Asia, all of them spread not by corporations, but by hands that shared freely. At county fairs and church gatherings, neighbors swapped seeds the way they swapped stories. Every farm, every community, carried its own living library of crops. Saving seeds gave farmers independence. It meant they could feed their families year after year without asking permission or paying anyone for the privilege. It gave communities resilience, because when one crop failed, neighbors shared their extras. And it gave food character, thousands of unique varieties, each adapted to its soil, its climate, its people. But this ancient right, the right to save, replant, and pass on seeds, is now treated as a crime in much of the modern world. What was once a farmer's duty to his children is now forbidden by law. In just a few generations, a freedom older than history has been transformed into a liability. They called it progress, a miracle of modern science. But behind every super seed was a secret: it would never give back what it took. In the 1930s, America was caught between the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Crops were failing, families were starving, and agriculture was in crisis. Then came a promise: hybrid seeds. By crossing two distinct parent plants, scientists created corn varieties that yielded more, grew stronger, and seemed to defy the harshness of the times. Farmers were captivated. Those who planted hybrids saw their fields swell with bigger ears of corn and sturdier stalks. It was a scientific revolution that spread quickly across the Midwest. The old ways of saving seeds suddenly looked outdated compared to this modern miracle. Hybrids gave farmers hope when hope was scarce. They promised consistency in a world shaken by droughts and poverty. And for many, they delivered. Harvests improved, profits rose, and families believed they had found salvation in a paper bag of scientifically engineered seeds. But there was a catch, one hidden in plain sight. Hybrid seeds did not reproduce true to type. The seeds harvested from a hybrid crop would not grow into the same strong plants. Instead, they produced weaker, less reliable offspring. Farmers, for the first time in history, discovered they couldn't simply save seed from their harvest and expect the same results. The cycle had been broken, not by law, but by biology itself. What began as a promise of progress quietly ended a tradition older than civilization. Farmers became customers, tied to companies that controlled the hybrid breeding lines. For the first time, seeds were not just grown, they were sold and resold every single season. They called it a revolution, a war on hunger. But every revolution has its price, and this one came with invisible strings attached. By the 1950s and 1960s, the world was changing fast. Populations were exploding, and governments feared famine on a scale never seen before. Enter the Green Revolution. Scientists like Norman Borlaug, often celebrated as the man who saved 1 billion lives, introduced high-yield varieties of wheat, rice, and maize. These crops grew faster, stronger, and promised to end hunger across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The movement was hailed as a miracle. Whole nations, once teetering on the brink of starvation, suddenly saw bumper harvests. Countries like India and Mexico shifted from food scarcity to food exporters. Newspapers praised the Green Revolution as the triumph of science over suffering. For families who had lived through hunger, the new seeds were a blessing. Governments funded massive distribution programs. Fertilizers and pesticides poured into fields, and farming became industrialized like never before. Hope spread as quickly as the new seeds did, and for many, it felt like the dawn of a new agricultural age. But buried beneath the triumph was dependency. These miracle crops demanded heavy doses of fertilizer and pesticides, sold by the very companies that provided the seeds. The soil grew weaker, requiring more chemicals each year. And just like the hybrid corn of America, these new varieties couldn't be reliably replanted. Farmers who once held their future in a sack of saved seeds now found themselves returning, season after season, to buy the next batch. The Green Revolution fed millions, but it also began to feed corporations, tying the survival of entire nations to companies and contracts. What was sold as liberation from hunger quietly became a chain of dependence. For centuries, life was considered sacred, beyond ownership. But in a single courtroom, that idea was overturned, and life itself became property. The year was 1980. In Washington, D.C., the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case that would ripple across every farm, every field, and every dinner table. It wasn't about corn or wheat or soybeans. It was about a bacterium, a genetically engineered microbe designed to eat oil spills. The case was Diamond v. Chakraborty. The question: could a living organism be patented like a machine, a chemical, or an invention? By a narrow 5-4 decision, the court said yes. The ruling declared that anything under the sun made by man could be patented, even life. At the time, most Americans hardly noticed. The headlines seemed distant, tied to science labs and biotechnology. But inside that decision was a seed of change that would transform farming forever. For corporations, it was a gold rush. The doors were now open to patent seeds, plants, and eventually, entire crops. What had once been free and shared by all could now be locked behind legal walls. Companies poured billions into biotechnology, eager to design the next generation of crops and claim them as intellectual property. For farmers, the consequences were profound. Seeds, the very foundation of agriculture, could now be owned by someone else. What had once been passed down freely from one generation to the next was suddenly a product, protected not by tradition, but by lawyers. It was a quiet revolution, one most Americans didn't even see happening. But it was the moment when the balance shifted. The ancient partnership between man and seed had been rewritten by law, and farmers would soon discover that the freedom to replant was no longer theirs to keep. It didn't start with corn, or soy, or wheat. The first plant to ever wear a patent was something far more delicate, a flower on the windowsill. In 1930, decades before utility patents would claim living organisms, Congress passed the Plant Patent Act. Its purpose seemed harmless enough: to protect the work of plant breeders who spent years creating new varieties. For the first time in American history, a plant could be patented. The first to receive such a patent was not a staple crop or a miracle grain. It was a flower, the modest petunia. Bred for its beauty, it became the pioneer in a legal experiment that would later spill into agriculture. In the decades that followed, roses, orchids, and fruit trees would also earn patents, marking a subtle but profound shift in how Americans thought about nature. To gardeners, this meant access to brighter colors, new blossoms, and endless novelty in their flower beds. For nurseries and breeders, it offered financial protection for their work. The average American hardly noticed. After all, what harm could come from patenting a flower? But beneath the surface, the foundation was being laid. The petunia proved that plants, once part of the shared commons of life, could be locked behind ownership. What began in the garden was destined to march into the farm field. That little flower was a test case, the thin end of the wedge. By the time patents reached the crops that fed the nation, the precedent had already been set. Seeds, once considered gifts of the earth, were now inventions on paper. The petunia may have seemed harmless, but it opened the door to a new world, one where every seed could carry a price tag, and every harvest could come with conditions. It began with a weed killer and ended with a company holding the keys to the world's food supply. By the 1970s, Monsanto was already a chemical giant. Its product, Roundup, a glyphosate-based herbicide, was marketed as a farmer's best friend, a spray that killed weeds quickly and efficiently. Farmers across America embraced it, and Monsanto made billions. But the real breakthrough came in the 1990s, when Monsanto introduced genetically engineered Roundup-ready seeds. These seeds were designed to survive heavy spraying of Roundup, meaning farmers could drench their fields in chemicals to wipe out weeds while leaving their crops unharmed. It was simple, effective, and revolutionary. Fields that had once required back-breaking labor to keep weed-free could now be managed with a single chemical. Corn, soybeans, cotton, all were soon engineered to work in lockstep with Roundup. For farmers, it felt like salvation. Weeds had always been the enemy, stealing nutrients and sunlight from crops. Now, with Roundup-ready seeds, yields went up, labor went down, and profits soared. Agribusiness hailed it as the future of farming. Monsanto marketed it as nothing less than feeding the world. But behind the miracle was a trap. To use Roundup-ready seeds, farmers had to sign strict agreements. No saving, no replanting, no sharing. Each year meant buying a fresh batch of seed directly from Monsanto and using Monsanto's chemicals to keep them alive. It was a closed loop, a perfect business model, one that turned farmers into annual customers locked into a cycle they couldn't escape. The company's power grew until Monsanto controlled a massive share of America's seed market. What had once been the farmer's independence was now a corporate franchise. Roundup had begun as a weed killer, but it ended as something else entirely, a tool of control. It looked like just another piece of paperwork. But with one signature, farmers surrendered a right as old as farming itself. By the 1990s, Monsanto's genetically engineered seeds were spreading rapidly across America. But there was a catch that many farmers didn't fully realize until they sat down at the dealer's desk. Alongside the bag of seed came a legal document, the Technology Use Agreement. This contract spelled out the rules. Farmers were allowed to plant the seeds for a single season only. They could harvest the crops, sell the grain, and reap the profit. But the seeds themselves could never be saved, cleaned, or replanted. That age-old cycle, stretching back thousands of years, was officially broken by the force of law. At first, most farmers didn't object. After all, the seeds worked. Roundup-ready crops delivered higher yields and easier weed control. The benefits seemed to outweigh the restrictions. To many, it felt like just another step in the march of progress, no different from buying fertilizer or renting equipment. But the agreement contained teeth. If a farmer was caught saving seeds, they could be sued for breach of contract, patent infringement, or even theft. Monsanto kept investigators on payroll, monitoring fields, gathering samples, and chasing down anyone suspected of breaking the rules. Suddenly, the ancient practice of setting aside part of the harvest for next year wasn't just discouraged, it was illegal. And the farmers who once shook hands with neighbors over shared seed swaps were now bound by corporate lawyers. A way of life had been transformed into a business arrangement, signed in ink and enforced in courtrooms. American seed laws didn't stay in the U.S. They began shaping fields on every continent. By the late 20th century, companies like Monsanto and DuPont had grown beyond national borders, exporting patented seeds worldwide. Countries across South America, Asia, and Africa began importing hybrid and genetically engineered seeds, often bundled with chemicals and strict contracts. This global expansion carried not just crops, but a new philosophy that seeds could be owned, controlled, and monetized. Local varieties that had sustained communities for centuries were rapidly replaced by uniform, high-yielding commercial seeds. In some regions, traditional practices of saving and exchanging seeds faced legal and financial obstacles for the first time. Corporations promoted patented seeds as tools for modernization. Governments supported these imports, seeking to increase productivity and secure food supply. Farmers, curious about higher yields and disease-resistant varieties, adopted them quickly. For many, it was a chance to improve income and harvest predictability. Yet the cost was hidden. Farmers who once relied on generations of local knowledge now depended on foreign companies for every planting season. Accidental cross-pollination could bring legal troubles, while entire ecosystems faced the risk of reduced genetic diversity. In a matter of decades, fields that once reflected centuries of local adaptation began to mirror corporate seed catalogs. Independence, diversity, and heritage gave way to contracts, patents, and globalized control. It started with a few stray plants on the edge of a Canadian field, but it ended with one farmer standing trial for stealing life itself. In the late 1990s, Percy Schmeisser, a canola farmer from Saskatchewan, Canada, noticed something strange in his fields. Some of his plants had developed resistance to Roundup, Monsanto's trademark herbicide. But Schmeisser hadn't bought Monsanto's patented Roundup-ready seeds. The resistant plants had blown in from nearby farms, carried by the wind, or by bees, or by the simple chance of nature. Monsanto's investigators swooped in, accusing Schmeisser of growing their patented seed without permission. What followed was a legal battle that shook the farming world. Monsanto claimed that, no matter how the patented genes arrived in Schmeisser's field, they still belonged to the company. Schmeisser argued that he never asked for them, that nature itself had put them there. The case caught international attention. To many, Schmeisser became a symbol of the independent farmer fighting back against corporate power. His story was told in newspapers, documentaries, and even classrooms. Around the world, people saw his struggle as a warning. If patented genes could spread naturally, then no farmer was safe from accusations of theft. In 2004, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled against Schmeisser. He was found guilty of patent infringement, even though he hadn't intentionally planted Monsanto's seeds. The decision sent a chilling message. Farmers no longer owned what grew in their own fields if it contained patented DNA. One farmer's quiet canola crop had exposed the harsh new reality that in the age of seed patents, even the wind could make you a criminal. Once upon a time, seeds were shared with a handshake. But in the new world of patents, neighbors began to look at each other with suspicion. For centuries, rural life thrived on trust. Farmers borrowed tools, traded grain, and most importantly, shared seeds. At county fairs, seed exchanges were as common as pie contests. A farmer might proudly offer his best corn kernels to a neighbor, knowing it meant those strong traits would spread through the community. But by the late 1990s and early 2000s, that sense of trust was unraveling. With companies like Monsanto enforcing strict contracts, seed saving was outlawed. Investigators roamed the countryside, collecting samples and questioning farmers. Rumors spread that informants were reporting neighbors who might be saving patented seeds. What was once community strength, sharing, suddenly became a liability. Farmers worried that if a patented seed ended up in their bins, even by accident, they could face devastating lawsuits. Instead of helping one another, many became cautious, even secretive, about what they planted. The spirit of cooperation that had sustained rural America for generations began to erode. In small towns where everyone once trusted each other, fear took root. Farmers whispered about the seed police at church gatherings. Longtime neighbors stopped swapping advice, worried that a friendly gesture could bring legal trouble. The bonds that once held communities together were slowly replaced by contracts, suspicion, and silence. A way of life that had always been built on shared survival was now divided by corporate rules. Farming had never just been about crops, it had been about community. And in the age of patents, that community was breaking apart. There was a time when seed was free, tucked into a burlap sack at the end of harvest. But now, a single bag comes with a price tag that can break a farmer's back. For generations, seed was one of the few things a farmer didn't have to buy. Each fall, families set aside part of their harvest to carry them into the next spring. It was a cycle as natural as sunrise. But as patented and hybrid seeds spread across the countryside, that tradition ended. By the late 20th century, seed had become a commodity, packaged, branded, and sold season after season. The cost of a bag of corn or soybeans, once negligible, began climbing steadily. What had been an almost free resource turned into one of the largest yearly expenses for a farmer. At first, many farmers justified the cost. Higher yields from patented seeds seemed to offset the price. But as time passed, the numbers didn't always add up. Prices for seed rose faster than the prices farmers could get for their grain. A bag of corn seed that once cost tens of dollars could cost hundreds by the early 2000s. Farmers found themselves deeper in debt, with fewer options. Contracts locked them into specific seed and chemical packages, squeezing margins tighter each year. The simple act of planting had turned into a financial gamble. Seed, once the symbol of renewal and hope, had become a burden. For many, the hardest part wasn't just the money, it was the loss of independence. Farmers who once prided themselves on self-reliance now stood at the mercy of seed dealers and corporations. A bag of seed was no longer a promise of tomorrow. For some families, it was a reminder of just how fragile their future had become. Imagine planting a seed, only to discover it was programmed to die. This wasn't science fiction, it was the future some corporations had in mind. In the late 1990s, whispers of a chilling technology began to spread through farming communities. Scientists had engineered what became known as Terminator seeds. These seeds were designed to grow for one season, and one season only. When farmers harvested them, the seeds produced were sterile, incapable of germinating. The idea came from a partnership between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and a private seed company. On paper, the technology was meant to protect corporate investments. If farmers couldn't save seeds, companies could guarantee a steady stream of purchases year after year. To corporations, this was the ultimate safeguard against seed piracy. To investors, it meant stability and profits. And to some scientists, it was a marvel of genetic engineering, proof of just how far biotechnology could reach. But to farmers, the very idea was terrifying. For thousands of years, the seed had been the heartbeat of continuity. A seed that self-destructed wasn't just an invention, it was a betrayal. Critics argued it would leave farmers entirely dependent on corporations, stripping away the last shred of independence they still had. Public outcry was swift. Farmers, environmental groups, and even some governments condemned Terminator technology as dangerous and unethical. Though it was never commercially released, the concept itself left a scar. The knowledge that such a technology could exist, seeds deliberately engineered to die, deepened mistrust and suspicion between farmers and the companies that sold to them. It wasn't just about biology, it was about control, and the fear that corporations would someday hold absolute power over the food chain. Every seed once carried a story, a flavor, a color, a memory passed down through generations. But many of those seeds are now gone, replaced by numbers on a corporate catalog. For centuries, families saved not just any seeds, but their seeds. A tomato that grew sweeter in their soil, a corn that withstood their region's storms, or a bean that carried a grandmother's name. These heirloom varieties were living history, shaped by the land and cherished by the people who grew them. But when patented hybrids and genetically modified crops spread in the late 20th century, many heirlooms quietly disappeared. Farmers who once traded seeds at church picnics or county fairs found fewer and fewer people saving them. Over time, the rich tapestry of flavors and colors that once filled gardens and markets began to thin out. Heirloom seeds weren't just practical, they were cultural treasures. A Cherokee purple tomato, a Kentucky wonder bean, or an old variety of dent corn carried the taste of place and the weight of memory. These seeds adapted to local climates, resisting pests and droughts in ways modern uniform hybrids often couldn't. But corporations offered higher yields and uniformity, and slowly, heirlooms were pushed aside. In a world chasing efficiency, diversity became a casualty. By the end of the 20th century, it was estimated that thousands of traditional seed varieties had vanished from commercial use. The loss wasn't only agricultural, it was personal. For many families, it meant losing the flavors that once defined their childhoods, the colors that once filled their grandmother's garden, and the resilience built over centuries of patient selection. When farmers could no longer replant or trade their heirlooms freely, a quiet silence fell across fields that once sang with variety. What was lost wasn't just seed, it was memory, culture, and identity. For centuries, the farmers' greatest battles were with drought, pests, and storms. But by the late 20th century, a new adversary emerged, lawyers armed with patents. In earlier generations, farming disputes were settled with a handshake or perhaps at the county courthouse over a boundary line. But once seeds became patented intellectual property, agriculture entered a new era. Suddenly, the act of replanting a seed could be considered theft. By the 1990s and 2000s, some of the largest agribusiness corporations in the world began aggressively enforcing their patents. Farmers accused of saving or reusing seed, even unintentionally, found themselves facing lawsuits worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. For many, the cost of fighting was more than their farm was worth. To the corporations, legal enforcement was about protecting innovation and investment. They argued that without strong intellectual property rights, research and development would grind to a halt. Courts often sided with them, reinforcing the idea that seeds, like software or music, were now owned, not shared. But for farmers, the lawsuits felt like an assault on their way of life. Neighbors grew suspicious of one another, fearing that a stray seed blown by the wind could become evidence in court. Trust, once the glue of rural communities, began to fray under the weight of legal pressure. Some of the most heartbreaking stories weren't of farmers who deliberately broke the rules, but of those accused when patented seeds drifted onto their land without their knowledge. Imagine standing in your field, watching your crop grow, only to be told that it no longer belonged to you. In the lawsuit era, the American farmer's enemy wasn't just drought or debt, it was the very system meant to protect progress. And for many, the courthouse became the new battlefield. It was supposed to be the perfect solution, a seed paired with a chemical that could wipe weeds away. But nature, as always, had other plans. When genetically engineered Roundup-ready crops hit the market in the 1990s, they promised simplicity. Farmers could spray their entire field with herbicide, killing the weeds but sparing the crop. For a while, it worked like magic. Weeds that once choked out corn, soybeans, and cotton shriveled overnight. But evolution is relentless. By the early 2000s, farmers began noticing weeds that no longer died. They stood defiantly in fields, resistant to sprays that once leveled them. Over time, these so-called superweeds spread across millions of acres, some growing taller than a man and stronger than steel. The technology had been marketed as a labor saver, reducing the need for tilling and hand weeding. For a few seasons, it did just that. But as resistant weeds took hold, the old problems returned, only worse. Farmers now had to buy stronger chemicals, use more of them, or return to the very methods they thought they'd left behind. Costs rose, yields fell, and frustration grew. What was once billed as progress began to feel like a trap. The superweeds weren't just plants. They were symbols of the unintended consequences of tampering with nature's balance. For farmers, it was heartbreaking. They had invested in expensive patented seeds and chemical packages, only to find themselves back where they started, but with fewer options and heavier debt. And there was a cruel irony. The very promise that had sold these seeds, the freedom from weeds, had turned into a new, nearly unstoppable adversary. Across the South and Midwest, stories spread of combines breaking against giant pigweed stalks, of fields abandoned because they could no longer be controlled. Progress, it seemed, had sown its own undoing. For every seed planted, there must be a partner in the dance of life. But across America's fields, the partners began to disappear. Pollinators, bees, butterflies, even humble beetles, have always been the unseen workers of agriculture. They drifted through fields and orchards, carrying pollen from flower to flower, ensuring harvests for generations. Farmers didn't have to think about them. They were simply there, as reliable as the sun. But by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, farmers began to notice something troubling. Beehives collapsed. Butterflies dwindled. The skies above fields that once hummed with life grew strangely silent. Scientists called it colony collapse disorder. a mystery linked to pesticides, monocultures, and the spread of genetically modified crops. The decline of pollinators struck at the very core of agriculture. Without them, fruits, vegetables, and countless crops would struggle to grow. It wasn't just about honey or flowers, it was about the survival of food systems themselves. Farmers who once took pollination for granted found themselves renting bees from keepers, trucking hives across states just to keep orchards alive. The old image of buzzing meadows and family gardens gave way to a more fragile reality. Food now depended on an endangered workforce. For many, the silence was haunting. A child walking through a field of sunflowers might once have heard the steady drone of bees, felt the tickle of butterflies brushing past. Now, those sounds and sights were gone. What vanished wasn't only an insect. It was a piece of the natural rhythm that bound farmer, seed, and land together. The vanishing pollinators became a stark reminder. Controlling seeds and chemicals might win short-term battles, but the cost was balance itself. And without balance, even the most advanced seeds could not guarantee a harvest. There was a time when seed companies were family-run, when a farmer could call the owner by name. But in just a few decades, those names vanished into mergers, swallowed by giants. Through much of the 20th century, seed companies were small, regional, and deeply connected to the communities they served. A farmer in Iowa might buy seed from a company in Iowa, run by neighbors who knew the land as well as they did. Competition kept prices fair, and variety thrived. But in the 1980s and 1990s, a wave of corporate mergers began reshaping the industry. One by one, local companies were bought up, consolidated under multinational conglomerates. Chemical corporations merged with seed companies, forming agri-giants that controlled not only what farmers planted, but also what they sprayed on their fields. At first, these mergers were sold as progress, promises of efficiency, research, and innovation. But as competition dwindled, so did choice. By the 2010s, just a handful of corporations controlled the majority of the world's seed market. For farmers, this meant fewer options and higher costs. Contracts grew tighter, independence shrank smaller, and the old days of bargaining with local seed dealers disappeared. The personal touch was gone, replaced by faceless corporations headquartered thousands of miles away. For rural communities, the merger wave wasn't just about business, it was about identity. The friendly logos of family-run seed companies vanished from barns and billboards, replaced by global brands with little connection to the soil they claimed to serve. The consolidation left farmers feeling smaller than ever. In towns where everyone once knew the seed man by name, all that remained were contracts, price sheets, and corporate reps reading from scripts. The warmth of local trust was traded for the cold efficiency of monopoly. Once, a farmer's word was enough. But in the age of patented seeds, a handshake was replaced by pages of fine print. In the past, the seed trade was simple. Farmers bought a bag of seed, planted it, and if they liked the results, saved some for the next year. No contracts, no lawyers, just trust and tradition. But with patented seeds came something new, binding agreements. To buy modern seeds, farmers had to sign contracts, technology use agreements that spelled out strict rules. No saving seeds, no replanting, no sharing with neighbors. Farmers weren't just buying seed anymore, they were licensing technology. The contracts promised access to cutting-edge genetics, higher yields, and protection from lawsuits, as long as farmers followed the rules. For many, it felt like the only way to keep up with modern agriculture. The glossy brochures promised prosperity, the paperwork promised restrictions. Over time, these agreements grew tighter. Farmers found themselves bound not just to one season, but to cycles of dependency. The contract dictated how they farmed, what chemicals they used, and in many ways, how much they earned. The real sting came when farmers realized they had traded more than money. They had traded freedom. A farmer who once decided how to run his land now had to answer to clauses in a document written by corporate lawyers. The land was still theirs, but the seed, the very foundation of farming, was not. And with every signature, independence slipped further away. Once upon a time, a trip to the market meant baskets overflowing with colors, shapes, and flavors. But over the years, that rainbow of choice began to fade. In earlier decades, grocery stores and farmers markets carried an astonishing variety of produce. Regional heirlooms and locally adapted crops offered everything from purple carrots to dozens of apple varieties. Families remembered the taste of tomatoes grown in their grandmother's garden, the smell of melons that filled summer evenings. But as patented hybrids and genetically modified crops came to dominate, commercial farming narrowed its focus. Crops were bred not for flavor or diversity, but for uniformity, shipping durability, and compatibility with chemical packages. The result: fewer varieties planted, fewer varieties sold. For corporations, standardization made sense. Uniform produce was easier to harvest, transport, and sell worldwide. A tomato that could survive a 1,000-mile journey was more valuable than one that tasted like summer sunshine. But for consumers, something was lost. The marketplace became a place of sameness. The same apples, the same tomatoes, the same corn. Entire flavors, textures, and cultural traditions slipped quietly out of reach. The disappearance wasn't just about what filled the shelves, it was about what didn't. Children grew up never tasting the foods their grandparents had known. A rich cultural inheritance was quietly erased, replaced by a corporate definition of choice. And so, while farmers signed contracts in the fields, families in the cities and suburbs found themselves unknowingly trapped as well. Their diets narrowed, their palates dulled, their traditions forgotten. In a world where saving a seed could mean breaking the law, a quiet resistance began to grow. Seed saving was once as ordinary as breathing. Farmers and gardeners set aside the best of their harvest each season, ensuring the next would be just as strong. But as patents tightened and contracts forbade replanting, seed saving became an act of defiance. Across America and in pockets around the world, small groups of farmers, gardeners, and activists began keeping the old traditions alive. They saved heirlooms, traded seeds in secret, and formed underground networks dedicated to preserving what corporations sought to control. Some even smuggled seeds across borders, determined to protect varieties that might otherwise vanish forever. These seed rebels weren't just hobbyists, they were guardians of biodiversity. Each seed they saved carried unique traits: drought resistance, unusual flavors, or cultural heritage tied to a specific community. Without them, much of the world's agricultural history would have been lost. Seed libraries sprang up in small towns, sometimes tucked into churches or community centers, where envelopes of corn, beans, and squash passed from hand to hand. It was a rebellion not with weapons, but with envelopes and jars. But there was risk. In the era of strict seed laws and corporate surveillance, saving or trading patented seeds could lead to crushing fines or lawsuits. For some farmers, what had once been a family tradition now carried the weight of potential ruin. Yet, they persisted. Because for these rebels, seeds weren't property, they were life itself. And in their quiet defiance, they reminded the world of something powerful. Freedom doesn't always come with a contract. Sometimes, it comes in the palm of your hand. They promised a revolution in farming, seeds that could resist pests, survive chemicals, and feed a growing world. But for many, those promises came with a question: at what cost? Genetically modified organisms, GMOs, entered American agriculture in the mid-1990s. Scientists spliced traits into crops that nature had never imagined. Corn that produced its own pesticide, soybeans immune to herbicides, cotton that could fight off worms. Corporations heralded these seeds as the solution to hunger and environmental stress. Fields would yield more, chemicals could be used more precisely, and farming would finally step into the future. For a time, optimism soared. Adoption was swift. By the early 2000s, the vast majority of America's corn and soybean fields were planted with genetically modified seeds. Supermarkets filled with products made from GMO ingredients, from cooking oils to breakfast cereals. But the debate was fierce. Supporters pointed to efficiency and innovation. Critics asked about long-term safety, not just for human health, but for ecosystems. What happened when engineered pollen drifted to wild plants? What would decades of eating altered foods do to our bodies? The truth was unsettling. No one really knew. The science was still young, the studies limited, the long-term effects uncertain. And so the GMO debate wasn't just about farming. It was about trust. Could families trust the companies who sold them these seeds? Could nations trust that the technology wouldn't spiral into unintended consequences? For farmers, the debate often felt personal. They stood between progress and fear, between feeding the world and wondering what hidden costs might one day emerge. Nature thrives on diversity, but modern farming turned vast landscapes into oceans of sameness. And sameness, as history has shown, can be dangerous. For centuries, farmers planted a mix of crops. Fields rotated between corn, wheat, beans, or clover, each crop restoring something different to the soil. This patchwork approach built resilience, keeping pests and disease in check while preserving fertility. But with the rise of patented seeds and industrial farming, diversity gave way to monoculture, vast expanses of a single crop stretching for miles. Corn in Iowa, soybeans in Illinois, cotton in Mississippi. Efficiency and scale were the new ideals. On the surface, monoculture seemed logical. Uniform crops were easier to plant, harvest, and sell. Machines worked better when every plant looked the same. Corporations encouraged it, offering seed and chemical packages tailored for single-crop dominance. But the hidden costs soon appeared. Without diversity, pests adapted faster, diseases spread farther, and soils wore out quicker. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s stood as a grim reminder of what happens when a society depends on one crop. Yet the world was now repeating the same mistake on a global scale. For farmers, the danger wasn't just theoretical, it was visible. Entire fields could fall to a single blight. Families who once mixed their plantings to hedge against failure now had no safety net. And in towns where fields once showed a quilt of colors and textures, the view became uniform, almost sterile. The land itself seemed to whisper that something vital had been lost. Billions of people depend on a system that looks strong, but behind the scenes, it's alarmingly fragile. Global agriculture now relies heavily on a handful of corporations controlling seeds, chemicals, and patents. A few key crops, corn, wheat, soy, and rice, dominate the world's food supply. These crops are engineered, controlled, and distributed through highly structured supply chains that span continents. In theory, this system feeds the world efficiently, but it's precarious. A single disease outbreak, drought, or disruption in seed supply can ripple across nations. Local adaptation and diversity, which once safeguarded harvests, have been largely replaced by uniform, patented varieties. Governments, corporations, and consumers all benefit from the predictability of this system. Global trade ensures that food is available in cities thousands of miles from where it's grown. But while convenience and scale dominate headlines, experts warn that this reliance on a small number of crop varieties is risky. The fragility isn't theoretical. A disease wiping out a single patented variety could starve millions. Farmers who once relied on their own seeds now depend on corporations thousands of miles away. The freedom to save a seed, to adapt crops to local conditions, has been replaced by dependency and vulnerability. It's a sobering reality. What feeds the world today is built on a foundation far more delicate than anyone realizes. And one misstep, a failed crop, a legal restriction, or a patent dispute, could send shockwaves through the global food chain. The future of farming isn't just about seeds, it's about rewriting life itself. In the 2010s, a new technology called CRISPR and other gene editing tools began transforming agriculture. Unlike traditional GMOs, which inserted foreign DNA, gene editing allowed precise changes to a plant's own genome. Scientists could make crops drought-resistant, pest-resistant, or higher-yielding with unprecedented speed. Corporations quickly saw the potential. Patents on gene-edited seeds promised to accelerate profits, giving companies even more control over what farmers could plant, how crops grew, and which traits were available in the marketplace. For farmers and policymakers, gene editing seemed like a dream. Crops could survive harsher climates, resist new diseases, and reduce pesticide use. The promise of better, faster, stronger crops made the technology almost irresistible. Consumers, too, were intrigued by the possibility of a more sustainable food system. Yet, like the earlier GMO debates, gene editing sparked concerns about ethics, long-term safety, and corporate control. The subtle danger lay in dependency. Every gene-edited seed could be patented, tied to contracts, and controlled by a corporation. The same farmers who had once saved heirlooms or experimented with crossbreeding now risked losing their ability to make independent choices. As science advances, the promise of innovation walks hand in hand with the risk of monopoly. The line between progress and control grows thinner with each new breakthrough, reminding us that even the most miraculous technology can carry unseen consequences. Can a company really own a living thing? For millions of farmers, the answer became a harsh reality. With patents, contracts, and gene editing technology, corporations have effectively claimed ownership over life itself. Seeds, once considered a gift of the earth, became intellectual property. Every gene, every trait, and every engineered characteristic could be patented, controlled, and monetized. Courts in multiple countries have upheld these rights, ruling that patented seeds cannot be replanted, shared, or sold without permission. Even accidental presence of patented genes in a farmer's field could trigger legal action, as seen in high-profile cases across North America and beyond. To corporations, this framework incentivized innovation. Protecting intellectual property meant companies could fund research, develop new varieties, and expand globally. For consumers, it promised more resilient crops and technological progress in food production. But for farmers, the stakes were existential. Ownership of life meant losing autonomy. Farmers who had once shaped their field through centuries of careful selection were now legally barred from continuing traditions of saving, trading, or even experimenting with seeds. The implications are profound. What was once common heritage, freely shared among communities, is now commoditized. Nature itself is treated as private property, and farmers must pay to participate in the very cycle that sustained humanity for millennia. It is a chilling thought that life, in the form of a simple seed, can be bought, sold, and legally controlled, turning the timeless act of planting into a transaction defined by contracts and patents. The storms are stronger, the summers hotter, and the rains unpredictable, and the seeds farmers rely on are more controlled than ever. As the 21st century progressed, climate change began reshaping agriculture in dramatic ways. Droughts, floods, and extreme temperatures became more frequent, threatening harvests worldwide. Farmers, once able to adapt by saving and selecting seeds suited to their local conditions, now found themselves dependent on patented varieties engineered to survive extreme conditions. Corporations responded with seeds touted as climate resilient. Drought-tolerant corn, flood-resistant rice, and heat-hardy soybeans promised to protect farmers from nature's growing unpredictability. But these solutions came at a cost. Farmers had to buy them each season, often paired with chemical packages they were contractually obligated to use. The appeal was obvious. In a world where a single weather event could destroy a crop, having genetically engineered, climate-adapted seeds was a lifeline. Governments, NGOs, and agricultural media promoted these seeds as essential tools for feeding a warming planet. Farmers adopted them eagerly, hoping to protect their livelihoods. For some, these seeds were indeed a lifeline, a way to continue producing food despite increasingly hostile conditions. Yet reliance on patented seeds deepened dependency. Farmers who once relied on their own knowledge, intuition, and local seed varieties found themselves tethered to corporations. Nature's unpredictability was now compounded by legal and financial vulnerability. In a cruel twist, the very unpredictability of climate, something beyond any human control, reinforced the power of companies that controlled patented seeds. Farmers' resilience, once rooted in independence, had been replaced by reliance on corporate lifelines. The seeds themselves are becoming smarter, and the farmer's role is slowly shifting from caretaker to data manager. In the 2010s and 2020s, a new wave of agricultural innovation emerged: smart seeds. These aren't just genetically engineered, they are embedded with digital technology. Tiny sensors, connected apps, and satellite monitoring allow companies to track how each seed grows, how much water it receives, and even predict yields with precision. This new era of digital farming promises efficiency like never before. Farmers can monitor their fields from a smartphone, adjust irrigation remotely, and receive data-driven recommendations for fertilizers and chemicals. Companies market these seeds as part of integrated systems designed to maximize productivity. For farmers, the promise was compelling: higher yields, reduced waste, and precision control over crops. Governments and investors hailed it as the next frontier of agriculture, combining biotechnology and AI to feed a growing population. Consumers, too, were intrigued. Digital farming suggested transparency and optimization, the idea that every crop could be tracked, measured, and improved. Yet the shift comes with a cost. Farmers increasingly rely on proprietary technology, apps, and data systems controlled by the same corporations that own the seeds. Decisions that were once made in the field, based on experience and intuition, are now guided by algorithms and corporate software. The farm, once a place of human judgment and family knowledge, is transforming into a monitored ecosystem where every seed is accounted for and controlled. Independence continues to erode, replaced by connectivity that is as much about oversight as it is about efficiency. Beneath every thriving field lies a fragile world, and in America, that world is disappearing faster than most realize. Healthy soil has always been the foundation of farming. Generations of farmers relied on crop rotation, cover crops, and careful cultivation to keep it fertile. But the rise of monocultures, heavy machinery, and chemical-intensive farming began to strip the earth of its vitality. By the late 20th century, vast swaths of farmland were experiencing erosion, nutrient depletion, and compaction. Rain and wind carried topsoil away, leaving land less productive and more dependent on fertilizers to sustain crops. Patented seeds could grow in this weakened soil, but they could not restore it. Corporations emphasized yields and resistance over ecological balance. The promise of high-production seeds masked the growing fragility of the land. Farmers who adopted these seeds initially saw productivity rise, reinforcing the belief that technology could replace traditional knowledge. Yet the environmental cost was accumulating, often out of sight. Without healthy soil, even the most advanced seeds would eventually struggle to thrive, and the dependency on chemicals and purchased inputs only increased. The erosion of soil isn't just a scientific problem, it's personal. Families who once passed down fertile land from generation to generation now see their heritage literally blowing away. The earth that sustained life and culture is gradually being lost, and no contract or technology can fully replace it. What was once a living foundation of independence has become a fragile medium, requiring constant intervention, monitoring, and corporate oversight. Farmers are no longer just growing crops. They are managing an ecosystem in decline. When the world seems to be losing its diversity, some are quietly safeguarding the future, one seed at a time. Amid the rise of patents, corporate control, and disappearing heirlooms, global efforts emerged to preserve agricultural biodiversity. Seed banks, secure vaults storing thousands of varieties of crops, became humanity's insurance policy against famine, climate change, and genetic erosion. The most famous, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, was designed to protect millions of seeds from disasters, both natural and man-made. Scientists and farmers alike recognize that these collections are more than just genetic material. They are living libraries of human history and survival. Seed vaults represent hope and foresight. They ensure that, even if patented seeds dominate today, tomorrow's farmers will have access to the diversity needed to adapt to changing climates, pests, and diseases. Communities around the world contributed heirlooms, keeping the legacy of generations alive. The story of seed preservation resonates because it connects science with tradition, technology with memory. It reminds us that, despite corporate pressures, there are those committed to protecting the planet's agricultural heritage. Yet the urgency remains. Each year, more varieties disappear from fields and markets. Without ongoing efforts, even seed banks could become insufficient against widespread genetic loss. The responsibility is immense. The fate of food security, cultural heritage, and ecological balance rests in part on these stored seeds. In every packet lies a story, a flavor, a resilience built over centuries, a tangible reminder that seeds are more than crops. They are the threads connecting past, present, and future. The story of seeds is far from over, and the choices we make today will shape the farms, foods, and freedoms of tomorrow. For millennia, farming has been a cycle of care, adaptation, and innovation. Each generation of farmers built on the knowledge of the last, saving seeds, selecting traits, and nurturing biodiversity. Today, that tradition is at a crossroads. Patented seeds, gene editing, climate change, and digital farming have transformed agriculture into something almost unrecognizable to past generations. Yet, alongside these challenges, new opportunities emerge. Community seed banks, regenerative agriculture, and sustainable practices are giving farmers tools to reclaim independence. Technology can now assist without dominating, and awareness of environmental impacts is sparking a movement to restore balance to the land. The future matters because it affects everyone. Farmers' decisions shape what appears on our tables, how ecosystems thrive, and whether agricultural knowledge survives. Young farmers, scientists, and activists are now more engaged than ever, working to create systems that balance productivity with ecological and cultural stewardship. The choice is profound. Will farming remain a story of corporate control and dependency, or can it return to its roots, resilience, diversity, and community? The next generation of farmers may be the first to navigate a world where every seed is both a tool and a responsibility. Seeds carry more than life. They carry hope. And as the sun rises over fields worldwide, the question remains, will we preserve freedom, heritage, and nature, or will they be lost to convenience, contracts, and control? As we look back over centuries of farming, one thing becomes clear. Seeds are more than soil and water. They are memory, culture, and survival, tiny vessels carrying the hopes and knowledge of generations. From heirloom varieties nurtured by hands long gone, to the patented, high-tech seeds of today, each tells a story of human ingenuity, struggle, and resilience. We've seen how farmers once freely saved and shared seeds, how innovation promised progress but brought dependency, and how quiet rebellions fought to preserve diversity and freedom. We've witnessed the delicate balance between nature and technology, between independence and control, and the fragility of the very food system that sustains billions. The story doesn't end here. Today, the choices we make, as farmers, consumers, and citizens, will determine whether the next generation inherits freedom, biodiversity, and the wisdom of the land, or a world where seeds and life itself are controlled by contracts and corporations. So as you walk past a field or open a simple packet of seeds, remember, each one carries a story. And in that story, there is hope. Hope that humans can restore balance, preserve diversity, and honor the legacy of those who farmed before us. If this journey through history, science, and resilience inspired you, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting, stories that uncover the past, explore the present, and help us shape a future worth growing. Thanks for watching America's Forbidden History, uncovering the stories they tried to erase. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a hidden chapter of history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep history alive.